This is Guy Burgess. In this post, I want to try to continue my efforts to map the many interlocking conflicts associated with authoritarian populism and, in general, the big political divide in the United States. And I think this extends to a lot of other countries in different ways as well. And again, a disclaimer before we go too far. This conflict is one that is highly polarized. And lots of folks on both sides pretty much view the other side as evil, and that their views are the sort of things that you ought to speak out and condemn. And if you can keep them from being expressed, so much the better sometimes. What we're trying to do here is talk about how you make peace between the left and the right. And that requires a fair amount of understanding and looking at the other side with some sense of sympathy and empathy. So if you find me justifying things that you disagree with, well, just listen and try to think about the problem in a more empathetic way. So at any rate, what I want to talk about here is the culture divide, the culture war, the questions, lifestyle questions over what's right and what's wrong between liberals and conservatives. And we might start by looking at conservative cultural beliefs. And there are a lot of different aspects of this, obviously. Maybe the first place to start is this notion of a social community built around patriarchal families, and where you have a breadwinner and a homemaker. And in a sense, very real sense, I think this came out of the kind of society that was dominant in the United States in the 50s and 60s. And there were pretty sharp sex role differences between men and women. And men would go and work in construction and coal mines and factories, and women would stay at home with the kids and be homemakers, which was, to be fair, I think a bigger job then, with less of the labor-saving devices that have come online since. But there was this kind of sense that all worked. And there was also a period where, at least for a lot of the country, there was a pretty high degree of cultural and religious homogeneity, built largely around Christian religions, communities stuck together. There was a certain sense in which folks were responsible for their community. You had scenes like this, which I've always thought reflected a real strength of a community, a barn raising where everybody comes together to build a barn for somebody. And it also was a time that came out of the Great Depression and World War II. My parents had 15 years of their lives torn up by the war and by the depression that preceded it. And these pictures from VJ Day, the end of the war, reflects the sense of everybody that they just were done with this. They wanted to get married, settle down, have kids. They got through the war by sticking together and respecting authority, and they're inclined to do that. And so you had an awful lot of this, and this was the rise of suburbia. In a sense, it was the economic golden age. Jobs were plentiful. Everything was new. We built the interstate highway system. We built houses. There were jobs for everybody. The level of social equity was much greater. The proportion of the society's wealth that went to the very rich was much less. In some sense, I think this is what people who say they want to make America great want to go back to. Now, it's also true that this was a time of the civil rights movement, a rebellion against absolutely unconscionable racist segregation. The pictures that come out of that era are pretty horrible. And so there was a tension as well. So I don't want to paint the picture that everything was perfect way back then, but there were parts of it And there was a set of cultural beliefs that people enjoyed. They may not want it now, but they wanted it then, and there's still people who want that. So this can get sort of summarized a little bit, that there was a mainstream dominant culture, Christian, white. It's pretty homogeneous. There was a respect for tradition, a respect for authority. There was a sense in which people subordinated themselves to the larger community. As I said, that was the key to getting through the war. There was also with this a moral clarity of what's right and wrong, pride and patriotism, and a willingness to defend the group. So that's one side of the cultural divide. Now, the progressive side looks a bit different. To a very real degree, I think Democrats are a misfit coalition. Will Rogers' famous line, "I don't belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." This was from a recent article. There's a citation on the page that the Republican Party can be described as an ideological group, while the Democratic Party is better thought of as a collection of interests. So there's a lot of different interest groups. Now, some of this comes out of the Civil Rights Movement and Johnson's signing of the Civil Rights Act, and the Democratic Party saying, okay, we are going to be the champion of people who have been racially discriminated against, really since the very beginnings of this country. It's a monumental step. The other thing that I think shaped the current progressive culture and the Democratic Party certainly was the women's movement. And I remember going to class in the early 1970s, and a very astute professor said, this is going to be a very, very big deal, because the inequities are, and he went out to outline all the legitimate complaints that women had. And when I was a graduate student, I worked in the same office as Elise Boldy when she wrote the book, The Underside of History, which is this enormous, thick volume. And it documents. I remember going into her office and books were literally stacked to the ceiling. And she distilled from this all of these horrible stories about how women had been treated in culture after culture after culture through the ages. And this was the beginning of a rebellion against that. This was also the time of Earth Day and the rise of the environmental movement. And folks who weren't alive back then have trouble understanding just how terrible the pollution problem was. We talk about a brown cloud in Denver now sometimes. Way back then it was a black cloud. I remember seeing pictures of 50-foot walls of soap suds coming off Lake Erie. And this was the time when the Cuyahoga River caught fire because it was so polluted. So that's another thing that drove. So you had all these different interest groups based on racial issues and gender issues and environmental issues that came together, and they challenged the establishment, which in a sense was being, in a very strong sense, was being championed by the Republicans. There were also changes in immigration policy. And we started to see in the exact history of something of this, something I'm not really clear about. It's an interesting article, though, that talks about just how much more diverse our society has become following immigration after 1965. And Democrats have a certain reason to be thankful to Ronald Reagan's deregulation because it led to a plummeting in the cost of airfare. And it became possible for a whole generation of young people to travel the world and do study abroad. And you had a sort of cosmopolitan international sense of the modern world. And that's something that earlier generations didn't have because they couldn't afford to go there. So you had lots of different groups with different agendas. And this, not surprisingly, was expressed with strong support for individual rights. The Declaration of Human Rights came earlier, but this individually focused approach. It involved moral relativism, that is, everybody's got a different set of beliefs. There is no absolute, this is the way it is kind of thing. Challenged a lot of basic Christian ideas. This also led to a lot of tension. You had a set of progressive family and gender roles that changed things. So what this led to is again a set of cultural traits on the progressive side that was very much at odds with the traits on the conservative side. And again, it's this notion of a misfit coalition of people who've been alienated from mainstream society. It's culturally and racially diverse. It's tolerant of many cultures. There's this notion of moral relativism. There still is a set of progressive values that folks are asked to adhere to, more individualistically focused, critical of traditional society and authority. So these things are coming into conflict. So let's try to back up a little bit and look at the big picture of what's going on here. First thing to keep in mind is that within group differences are still very, very large, and in many ways larger than the between group differences. These are pictures of Obama and Trump's inauguration. They look sort of pretty much the same. They're just different people. But there's a lot of variation within these groups. So you don't want to get the idea that they're all monolithic and homogeneous. We've also seen something that Bill Bishop called the big sort. And society has progressively been sorting itself into liberal and conservative communities. I grew up in Colorado Springs, which is now very, very conservative. I now live in Boulder, Colorado, which is now very, very liberal, not too far from each other along the mountains in Colorado, but culturally very, very different. Now, Tom Edsall of the New York Times runs a series of articles that are, in a sense, literature reviews that try to help understand some of the big issues. And this is an excellent one. The title's a little bit misleading, though. What he is a review of theories of the differences between liberals and conservatives. And he's a little liberal and sort of tends to favor the liberal side of things. But it gives you a window. And I highly recommend looking at that as well. Rather than talk about all of the ways of trying to understand things, I want to highlight just a couple of ideas. George Lakoff, who has written a lot of very perceptive stuff on these issues, and I recommend his work, made a distinction between strict father cultures, conservative strict father cultures, where father knows best and lays, this is the way you're going to do it, and the nurturing parent cultures of progressives. Our colleague Mary Fitzduff became fascinated with this sort of emerging field of neuroscience and started looking at these issues and how they pertain to conflict. And there, I think, is good reason to believe that in any population, there are people who fit both Lakoff's strict father traditionalist model and folks who fit the nurturing parent model that encourages a considerable amount of individuality, creativity, going off and trying new things. And in evolutionary terms, this makes sense. Any human societies are so successful because by and large we work together. So it's important to have, both biologically and culturally, strong incentives for everybody to sort of work together. But you also need a certain amount of creativity to respond to new and changing conditions. So you need the sort of more individualistic, ornery, creative types. And so you need both of these. And so the question is, what's the proper relationship between them? And liberals like to think of themselves as the creative culture, the culture of peace sometimes. But there is, as I mentioned earlier, this orthodoxy. So there is a certain sense in which they abide by strong traditions. It's just a little different from Republican traditions. Another way to look at this is in the context of William Ogburn's notion of cultural lag. Cultures adapt to changing physical conditions in the society. And some folks adapt faster than others. And some societies change faster than others. So here's a chart, and again, you can follow the citation and look at the details of what it is that women want in men and vice versa has changed from 1939 to 2008. So you get these huge cultural shifts, but they're shifts in time different than two competing groups. Or you can take this chart, which looks at changes in support for same-sex marriage over time. And again, you have this shift. So in this context, people who disagree with you may either be lagging behind the ambient changes that are happening in society, or they might be leaping ahead. But in a very important sense, those that are lagging or behind or leaping ahead aren't evil for doing so. And it's worth giving folks a chance to A, catch up, or B, for the folks who've leaped ahead to maybe realize they leapt too far and go back. There's also a sense in this, talking about the cultural divide, that cultural issues are not so compromisable. These are right-to-life pro-choice demonstrations. And, if you believe abortion is tantamount to infanticide, it's hard to compromise on that. So however we deal with cultural issues, you've also got to deal with this uncompromisable character. Now, two big ideas that in their articles on this and beyond intractability that provide what I think is the best window here is this notion of coexistence and the notion of tolerance. That the only way you can really have a society that has these two groups, and if this evolutionary neurobiology stuff is right, all societies have these groups, is with a spirit of coexistence. Let everybody live the way they want to live and tolerate those differences. One of our colleagues is a founder of the Human Dignity and Humiliation Studies group, and has been cataloging the ways in which disrespect are a big driver of conflict. So if you're going to have coexistence and tolerance, there also needs to be a sense of mutual respect. Now, there's some good reason to believe that folks are catching on to this. This is, I think, an encouraging article that talks about how there's strong and increasing support for gay marriage and gay sex, even though a lot of people who support it think it's immoral. So that's this coexistence and tolerance. I don't like this idea, but if you want, that's okay. That's the formula that I think can work. Now, there are obviously limits to tolerance, and certainly the Islamic State represents one, and there comes a point where you've just got to oppose things. Then the question is how to do that most constructively. But the peace-building challenge is to figure out how we can have these two very different groups live together with some form of coexistence, but still a certain amount of competition, but constructive competition over ideas over the long term, and diffuse what is rapidly or has already escalated into a highly destructive confrontation.